Hey everyone, welcome back to another exciting episode of Starknet Espresso, where we sit down with brilliant minds pushing the boundaries of what is possible in crypto. I'm your host, Uche, and today we are thrilled to welcome someone who is turning heads with sharp insights on Bitcoin decentralization, Mempool dynamics, and the future of programmable Bitcoin. Host Capone. Whether it's breaking down MEV risks or sharing bold takes on Upcat and BitVM, he's been a voice that challenges assumptions and sparks fresh debates. Recently, he was awarded a Starknet grant to explore Upcat's impact on Bitcoin. We are going to get into all of that and more. Let's get started. Welcome to the show, Host Capone. It's such a pleasure to have you on Starknet Espresso today.
Yeah, very happy to be here and appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thank you. So, without wasting much time, why don't you just introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a bit about how you go into Bitcoin and your journey so far?
Yeah, so I've been in the sort of Bitcoin financial exposure space. I've had exposure to the asset for a very, very long time. I found it like really novel and interesting. I think I might have like first kind of discovered it through Reddit or something like that. But I think I had kind of a similar experience that most people have. I thought of it as kind of just a silly internet money. It was a number on some dude's server type of thing. And eventually, some of the like counterparty risk components of it became a little bit more meta in like popular conversation, started asking a bunch of questions, became a little bit more aware of what the whole premise of like a trustless, auditable, decentralized network was. And got really fascinated with it. It ultimately wound up kind of funding some other, like my own sort of business ventures later. I did a lot of work in the music industry, completely independent of crypto. And then in the sort of 2019, 2020 era, I decided to get a lot more hands-on in the technical and development aspects, started doing a lot more research contracting, did some like contract app development stuff here and there. And I've just been a nerd for it ever since.
Oh, great. Quite fascinating journey that you've had. Because I was going to ask, you have a voice that speaks to the complicated issues on Bitcoin, especially when it comes to mempools and transaction filters. So I was going to ask, has it always been your interest in the technical aspect of Bitcoin, or it was something that developed as you go into the ecosystem further?
Yeah, so I got rather captivated by the evolution of MEV on Ethereum and did a lot of like independent MEV researching myself, and then had a very like front row seat to like what the complications of MEV were for block producer incentives and like how that affected sort of the consensus participant set for Ethereum. And that so the involvement in like independent MEV searching sort of evolved into like an MEV resistance degree research component. Like how would you have this permissionless set of authors writing sort
Yeah,
of market orders, right? But
yeah,
not have it collapse into like more permission sets or more proprietary sets that undermine things like censorship resistance. And this
yeah.
is a really, really relevant conversation for Bitcoin right now. And I think there's like there's two factors that drive it. Is one, like we're just seeing a lot of application layer growth in Bitcoin, and new
Yeah,
applications create new MEV or MEV like opportunities.
yeah,
But also Bitcoin is just sort of like natively oblivious when it comes to MEV. I mean, there's a lot of high level understanding, but I think a lot of the sort of minutia and meat of like what MEV is, how it evolves, the effects that it has, aren't particularly well understood in Bitcoin. And so I think we, as like the Bitcoin hive mind, are like kind of in the process of unpacking all of this. And with the various soft fork agendas that are on the table and have been on the table for the past several years, they become like even more and more and more relevant, right?
Yeah, sure, sure. One of your tweets, you mentioned that filters are either failing or potentially centralizing hash rates. Can you walk us through this concept and why it's become such a growing concern for the Bitcoin network?
Sure. Yeah. So I think the best way to understand it is to understand how it evolved in Ethereum and how it is evolving in Solana, which are like the two most economically relevant uh, alternative networks, right? So in Ethereum, uh, the earliest like prototypical modes of MEV were things that miners, block producers did. They would like a really sort of like crude example would be maybe somebody creates like an NFT mint, but they set the activation for the mint at a block time instead of a block height. And so
Yeah,
a miner who is like aware of this contract lies a little bit about the block time to like skew it, and then they get a bunch of transactions in to mint the NFT before like it goes out into the public market, before like the
yeah,
developer's web portal opens and you can mint it. Um, it, eventually it became more of like what we commonly refer to as MEV today, like sandwich attacks and arbitrage
yeah,
and things like that. And though a lot of that was actually done in this very like what I would call a mempool PvP kind of way, right? Like there were
yeah,
independent searchers who weren't block producers that were just building transactions, kind of gamifying the algorithm that block producers use to create blocks to get the
yeah,
ordering the way they wanted it to be. And eventually, the sophistication of this MEV uh, became greater and greater and greater. Like doing sandwich attacks against Uniswap v2 or Uniswap v3 or whatever, like that was like pretty common knowledge. But there'd be like other more esoteric forms of MEV that really set the like upper band of MEV revenues or margins. And knowing where to look for those and like how to exploit them was it took a lot of research and development, right? It was kind of an expensive
yeah,
enterprise. And so Ethereum block producers, one, the block producers, they were kind of getting a cut of the sandwich stuff just from the fact that you would bid higher in fees to game that block creation algorithm, right? So that's
yeah,
like
yeah,
the miner's cut. But the miners could get a better cut by actually making a deal with a RPC provider like Flashbots, right? So
yeah,
the block instead of the block producer taking like the public independent searcher, the mempool PvP orders, they instead take these like proprietary orders from an RPC provider to include in their blocks, and they get a
yeah,
higher percentage of the revenue extracted that way. But they also get access to this like high degree of like esotericism or research and development requirements for like these edgier modes of MEV. And eventually, an enormous percentage of the block producer set in Ethereum was subscribed to a single RPC provider, Flashbots. That's shifted around a lot since. There's now like two or three sort of predominant RPC providers. Who actually is dominant at a given moment kind of shifts around. And then also like
yeah,
the application growth in Ethereum kind of slowed down for for a good while. So the number of people who knew about the edgier modes of MEV increased, right? Like the research sort
yeah,
of bled out into the system. And so there's a little bit of like an ebb and flow dynamic where like somebody like new applications release, somebody figures out the MEV, that one person becomes really dominant in building blocks, right? Even though you have a bunch of
yeah,
miners, basically they're the only one building a block. And then this shifts back and forth over time. And the periods where it's at its peak are like really concerning because if all of the block producers are subscribed to one template provider, then you don't really have censorship resistance, right? Even though you
yeah,
have this wonderful decentralized set of block producers, you only have one guy that's actually picking the order flow that's going into the blocks. And there's, so researching ways to kind of break that hold on the market, or reduce the proprietary nature of some of the edgier modes of
yeah.
MEV, commoditizing MEV software, things like that. Like those are all components of like MEV research.
I'm looking at everything you've said now because I think this is something similar to what we are having on the Bitcoin network with filters and all. I'm trying to play a hypothetical game. What happens in the worst case scenario? Let's say most of the large miners adopt these widely used filters. What is going to happen to the ecosystem in such scenario?
Sure, yeah. So it's a pretty simple worst case scenario to set up. It would be one where there's like one person who has the highest control over the highest degree of control over the highest rate of premiums in block templates. They produce the most profitable block templates, right? And they license those templates to all of the block producers. And so it doesn't matter how many miners you have. There's just one guy that's picking all that transaction inclusion. That's like the worst case scenario. And
Yeah.
you could like tack on some other kind of thing. Like maybe that person writes like 2-year contracts with each of the block producers or something, right?
Yeah.
So even if there's like this ebb and flow mechanism, they still keep their moat, their commercial moat around their service is sort of built on these out of band, like off chain contracts, like meat space contracts. Um, yeah, that would be like the worst case.
Oh, great, great. I'm looking at this growing concern now, and I mean, I think MEVs has been around for the longest time, but it's not been prominent as it is now in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Would you attribute this growing concern to introduction of new asset classes like ordinals and runes coming into the ecosystem?
Yeah. So uh, depending on how lax you want to be with what you include in the definition of MEV, you could make some arguments that like there will always be some kinds of MEV. So like an example, right? Like if you had the most basic version of Bitcoin possible and there was like no alternative assets, there was nothing like that. Maybe a block producer could still like arbitrage between centralized exchanges. Like there's a slightly different price between Coinbase and Binance, right? And so the guy
Yeah,
with the most hash rate has the best odds of like arbitraging that difference or something like that. These are all like really minority weights. They're not necessarily the type of thing that I think is like a concerning factor in like the censorship resistance potentials for MEV. I think
yeah,
any miner can participate in that. That's like a really important component of this is like if you have a mode of MEV that any miner has access to, then like who really cares, right? Like it's
yeah,
not really that big of a deal. Um, but when you start introducing alternative assets, presumably you have some kind of exchange rate between those assets, right?
yeah, yeah,
And that the fluctuations in that exchange rate and the fluctuations in how transactions execute, when they execute, who's getting what kind of value out of those exchange rates, the spreads and whatnot. Um, that is a very much a driving sort of primitive in MEV. And so I think that you can make a really, really sort of concise and tenable argument where like if you have heterogeneous assets, like if you introduce a lot of different tokens and NFTs and stuff like this, you're going to see MEV evolve in some form. And we have examples of this with Bitcoin, right? So
yeah,
when inscriptions came around, the the actual swap mechanism that we used for inscriptions to like develop trustless marketplaces and things like this is a special sig hash flag, and we don't have to get too far in the weeds on the technicals there if you don't want to, but there's
yeah,
a special sig hash flag that you use to create a partial transaction, right? And that
yeah,
partial transaction is basically an ask order. It's saying I'll give you this inscription for this amount of Bitcoin, and the whole premise there is that someone else can come along and build up the rest of the transaction around your ask. They can finalize the transaction. And
yeah,
because someone else can come along and finalize the transaction, even after, like, let's say you make an ask and then I finalize an order around it, right? When
yeah.
I broadcast that order, somebody else can take that order out of the mempool and reconstruct their own order around it. And
Oh,
so let's
wow.
say that they really like the price that you're buying my inscription at, right? Like they
Yeah,
wish that they could buy it at that price. Well, what they can do is they can take your order, wrap a new order, their own order around it, buying it themselves, but with a slightly higher fee rate, right? They pay
yeah,
the miners a little bit more. And so the miner's going to prioritize their order over your order. And so they wind up buying it instead of you, right?
yeah,
And this created again another chapter of this like mempool PvP era style MEV, where it's not really the miners that are extracting the value. The miners are getting paid for the value being extracted because the fees are being treated as an auction, right? There's
yeah,
an
yeah,
increment in the fee rate. But yeah, we had it was a really sort of a wacky several months where there was just this like wild PvP era in the Bitcoin mempool where we were all like sniping each other's transactions and stuff.
yeah.
Um, And yeah, I think that's a very analogous, like prototypical mode of MEV to the way that we saw MEV develop in Ethereum. And so I guess what I would say from that is like we're seeing MEV evolve along, you know, not technically precise pathways, but sort of vaguely analogous pathways to the way we saw
Yeah.
it evolve in Ethereum.
Oh, fair enough. So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, how are we going to solve this particular growing concern? I mean, because we're not looking at something like Starknet. You know, in Starknet they use things like sequencers, so I don't think it's susceptible to this kind of what would you say, manipulation. But from your own perspective, how do you see this being handled to balance Bitcoin to include even the smaller miners? Because I think with at this rate they might seem to be disenfranchised.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to look at this, but I think that they all kind of like consolidate down to like two sort of generalized approaches, right?
Yeah,
One is to teach the miners how to do the MEV, right?
yeah,
And each mode of MEV, each behavior, like a sandwich versus an arbitrage versus this like RBF sniping we were just talking about, those are like
yeah,
individual modes of MEV. And there's a different like technical implementation, like a different bit of code, a different system, a different part of your technology stack that handles that MEV. And if you can account for like all of the sort of economically relevant modes of MEV, and you can ship software to the miners that extract that MEV, then like you sort of don't care anymore. Like the
yeah,
censorship resistance component is now gone because
right,
you're not going to wind up relying on that centralized template provider that we were discussing earlier.
yeah,
Now it's really just up to the application developers to protect their users from the extractive behavior, right? Which I think is a great
yeah,
relationship to have. I think that if you set it up to where like the default expectation is the block producers will extract the revenue, the applications need to protect the revenue from being extracted, and then the users have like a sense of demand from applications to protect them, right? Like I think
yeah,
that's a very good market dynamic, and that preserves the censorship resistance component.
yeah,
Um, the other approach is if you were to say something like, well, we can't account for all the modes, there's like too many modes, like every time a new application releases there's a new mode of MEV, and we can't commoditize that software, we can't teach all the miners how to do it.
yeah,
Then what you do instead is you limit the number of possible modes of MEV. You say, okay, well, we're going to tighten the application space and make it to where you can't just like release a new application every 2 weeks. Like
yeah,
there's just not that many applications to do, right? We're going to
yeah,
pick the few things that we know we really need for our product, the blockchain, to thrive in the market. And we're going to focus on those, and we're going to make sure that we can do those really well. But we're not going to have this like rampant, the thing a lot of people would typically like, they tend to refer to it as like the Cambrian explosion of apps, right?
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
you can say, okay, well, we don't want the Cambrian explosion of apps. We want conservatism, and we want to say that you can only do these things. And like maybe there's a couple of modes of MEV in those things. That's fine, but we know what the modes are, and we can commoditize the software for those.
yeah. But wouldn't that be some sort of censorship if you're going to like have a rule that says that stops the explosion of apps being released every week? Because the whole idea is that Bitcoin is a free network and everybody is open to come in and do what they want as far as they're playing by the rules. So including this kind of gatekeeping, isn't that censorship in its own way?
No. So basically what you're doing is you're confining like the rules of physics for the blockchain, right? Like
Yeah,
you're saying that it's not possible to do this thing, and that would like you can't censor somebody by preventing them from doing something that's physically impossible, right?
yeah,
Like that's not censorship. Of course, like in the greater meat space realm, it is physically possible. They can go do it on another network, and maybe there's like some
yeah,
market share forfeiture or something like that from Bitcoin. But I think that what censorship really means is like preventing somebody from doing something that is physically possible, right?
yeah,
And if the network is just abdicating itself from some market share and saying, well, we don't want that to be possible, and the reason it's doing that is to protect censorship resistance, to say that we do want to make sure that anybody can do the physically possible things, then like I think that this is a so like let's set it up, right? Like let's say that Ethereum became completely captured by MEV, right? Like it
Yeah,
became
yeah,
fully censored. It was like completely censored, and it was game over. And like there was no argument that Ethereum was a neutral, decentralized platform any longer, right?
yeah,
Would you then say like, oh, Bitcoin better do all the things Ethereum did that led to that conclusion, right? So surely we wouldn't say that, right? We we
yeah,
we
yeah,
we
sure.
wouldn't argue. Yeah, right. So I think that, and also I like this dynamism between Bitcoin and ETH, to be perfectly honest. I like the fact that Bitcoin is, the way that I've described it in the past is like Bitcoin is like the conservative storm shelter, bomb shelter. Like we know this is going to work, right?
Yeah,
And we want to be, we don't want to ossify, but we want to be very conservative about the changes that we make. We want to really understand the implications of changes. Whereas Ethereum is like the move fast, break things. Like we're just going to kick open every door. We're going to see what people want to do. We're going to explore every angle of the market, and we're going to
yeah,
see what happens. Right. I like
yeah,
the fact that both of those paradigms exist in the market. I don't think that we would have anywhere near as robust or interesting of a market today if we had both chains being conservative or both chains being extremely liberal.
yeah. So one might even ask the question, who decides what apps are released on the, are we looking at a consensus system where the community is going to vote for the apps that are going to come in? Or again, the question is who decides?
Well, so within the confines of the things that are physically possible, right? No one
Yeah,
decides. If
yeah,
someone were deciding within those confines, that would be censorship,
yeah,
right? And
true.
that would like be problematic. But in the like space outside of that, right? Like the not possible space, you're saying that what sets those boundaries is the consensus rules of the network, right? The
Yeah,
actual
yeah,
network participants decide what is and isn't possible as an application. And Bitcoin makes those decisions again very conservatively, whereas by comparison, Ethereum makes those decisions in, I think, kind of the most liberal fashion possible.
yeah, great, great. Let's dive into one of the most trending topic on Bitcoin today, and that is the idea of making Bitcoin programmable. It is certainly one of the hot topics on Starknet and Starkware. And I think it boils down to all, what would you say, expanding the use case for Bitcoin. And I know you've tweeted a little bit about BitVM. You've been very passionate in your tweet about the possibility of, getting BitVM on Bitcoin. Can you explain to maybe our listeners who are joining for the first time what BitVM is and how it's going to transform the landscape of what Bitcoin can do?
Yeah, so the BitVM paper, when it was originally presented, was like a very like aha moment, I think, for everyone. Like
Yeah,
even a lot of like upper echelon Ethereum uh, organizations were like very sort of like shocked by the implications of the paper. I remember
yeah,
like Dan Robertson from Paradigm, he got very engaged in the conversation for a bit.
yeah,
But the basic premise is that you can write any program you want in Bitcoin script. It's just a really big program, right? Like even very,
yeah,
very basic things are really, really big to write. And they're like, for I guess just to give a rabbit hole that people can go down if they want. The premise is that you can write a NAND gate, like in very low level computation. We have the idea of logic gates. There's like an AND gate and an OR gate. There's another type
yeah,
of gate called a NAND gate. And if you can make a NAND gate, you can actually use NAND gates to make all the other types of gates, right?
yeah,
And so that like establishing the fact that you can make a NAND gate proves that you can make any program. And
yeah,
that was the anchor of the BitVM paper. Here's how you make a NAND gate. Guess what, guys? We can do all of it. Uh, but because these programs are very, very large, it would be like really irrational for people to try and do even very basic smart contracts on the L1 directly with them. And so most obvious applied jurisdiction for BitVM, like the thing that you actually want to do with BitVM, is to create a bridge, right? Like we're gonna do the least like active component of this programmability. We're just going to bridge into a programmable ecosystem, and we're going to write that bridge in a way where most of the time you don't see the program. The program's not exposed on the base layer. You really
Yeah.
only ever see the program if there's a contentious withdrawal or something, like somebody's trying to withdraw, but they're being censored, or somebody attempts to withdraw, but it's like illegitimate withdrawal, any kind of contentious withdrawal
Yeah.
mechanisms. And exactly how that works depends on, we're now at the point where we have a bunch of different variations on BitVM. So the
Yeah.
minutia kind of fans out in terms of how it works. But yeah, like, so you get these very, very simple transactions, things that look very simple in the blockchain, but they function as reliable bridges into these other ecosystems. And then once you're on the other side of that bridge, you can really do whatever you want. Like, it could be, you could slap an EVM in there, which is what a lot of people are doing today. You
Yeah.
could slap an SVM and do like a Solana VM in there. You could write a whole new type of VM. You could do really whatever you want.
Yeah. Oh, great, great. So I think one of the things I'm looking at what you explained. It feels like something relating to optimistic rollups in AVM. So where you have uh a period of time where people can say, okay, this is a fraudulent transaction, and then it can be flagged. Is that something similar to it?
Yeah,
Not sure. Go
exactly. So
ahead.
these are actually very analogous to optimistic rollups. And so the technical implementation of them would be more accurately described as a validity rollup, which is the interface that we typically refer to as ZK rollups.
Yeah.
Like when we're talking about rollups in Ethereum, we commonly sort of break it into two sets. We say optimistic versus ZK, right?
Yeah.
The actual prover that's being used in most of the BitVM setups is a validity rollup. It's closer to a ZK, but the way that the withdrawal process functions on the blockchain is more similar to an optimistic rollup.
Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. I think validity rollup is also what Starknet uses in their own tech. So I'm going to let's get into the upcut. And again, once again, congratulations on the fund that was given by Starknet on upcut research. A big congratulations to you on that. How was it for you to get that recognition from Starknet, and what was your first reaction to it?
Well, I was actually a little bit hesitant initially. Abdel kind of like talked me into it over a bit of time. Um, I I engaged in a lot of like public commentary about OpCat.
Yeah.
I have a lot of friends in the engineering space, and we hang out together, and so you wind up talking about these things. And eventually it kind of got to the point where like basically I was like the last OpCat critic standing. Like, everybody else had drunk the Kool-Aid
Yeah.
and wanted OpCat. And so the volume on the criticisms kind of wound up cranking up, because like if it ever came up, if there's only one guy in the room that's like making hopefully salient criticisms, that
Yeah.
one guy naturally kind of becomes a little bit louder, I think.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that kind of evolved as it was. Abdel approached me, was like, hey, there was actually quite a few people who, in kind of a baiting fashion, they were like, well, if you have such good evidence, blah blah blah, why don't you go take the bounty? And I was like, I'm not really in it for the bounty, guys. Like, I really just want to like help Bitcoin do well.
Yeah.
um but yeah, anyway, Abdel eventually talked me into it, and I think that uh ultimately, like, there's basically two paths for me personally, right? Like,
Yeah.
either I can be like sort of greedy with my interpretations of what I think MEV looks like as a future paradigm, and like I could be like, okay, go activate OpCat, create the MEV markets, and then let me just like be the MEV operator, and I'll win the MEV game, right?
Yeah.
Or I can go, I can lean in towards funding opportunities and distribute some of that research, have the conversation in more of an open forum. Maybe it affects the OpCat activation path, maybe it doesn't. But if opcat does get activated, then having the pretext set up to do that software commoditization process, I think is much
Yeah.
more favorable. So I think for me, like what became the deciding factor for me and the reason that I took the grant offer was that, right? Like, okay, if we're going to activate opcat, then commoditizing the software is going to be a very important component to preserving censorship resistance on Bitcoin. And in order to commoditize that software, we need to aggregate a lot of like smart people to work on this
Yeah.
problem. Because
Yeah.
it's a very hard problem. I mean, there's billions of dollars of funding in this for Ethereum, and it's like still kind of not solved.
Yeah.
I would say it's still not solved at all, but like it's gotten better. It's not as bad as it was.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think that was ultimately the deciding factor for me.
Oh, great. Since the announcement have been made, there's relatively been very low activity on your account with regards to that development. So I feel very opportune and honored to maybe one would say have an exclusive interview with you since that announcement has been made. So I want to ask, I understand you're taking a neutral approach to this, first of all. So what's been your first assessment of OpCats? What do you think about it?
I think that you certainly can write these like highly expressive scripts using it. But they're not the most affordable scripts in the world. They're pretty large. Like if you want to do anything particular, like if you want to emulate popular products in the EVM context, you wind up with like at best multiple kilobyte scripts, right? And so
Yeah.
these are quite expensive. So it becomes a question of like who is it useful to, right? Like if the only thing that it's useful to is like people to play with very low market cap tokens and stuff like an AMM, then
Yeah.
it probably just doesn't even ever happen, right? Like the scripts are just too expensive, you can't do anything with it. But if it's very useful for like a cross-chain messaging protocol or a stable coin issuance and redemption mechanism or something
Yeah.
that would get like much larger bids, like a much higher volume and higher individual value in transactions, then I think you do see it. I think that there are those applications, and I think we would see those applications if we activated CAT. So the
Yeah.
research is focused around basically like, okay, what can you do? Who is likely to do it? How much economic impact would that have on fee premiums, on like miner revenues? And is that fee premium enough to actually alter block producer behaviors, right?
Yeah.
Because like if all you're doing is you're creating like an extra $400 or $500 per block or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Most block producers in Bitcoin probably wouldn't even respond to that, right? Like they wouldn't change their what they're doing with their blocks in order to capture a couple $100 per block. But if you were
Yeah.
doing $3,000 per block, all of a sudden it's like, okay, as soon as one block producer changes what they're doing to capture this, all the other ones are basically going to be forced to do it as well,
Yeah.
or else they
True.
get outmoded. And so yeah, setting up that problem and quantifying all of like the factors that go into the actual block producer behaviors is kind of the nature of the research. And it starts with understanding the revenue models for miners, the market models for applications, and the cost of applications. So that's script, and then who uses, what do the scripts look like, who uses it, how much money does it generate, and how much money do the miners care about?
Yeah, great, great. I'd say some of the focus areas that was mentioned on the announcement was a focus on, and I think we've talked about this largely this night, but I think one of the focus areas they mentioned was MEV and block incentives, and you touched on it very well now. How do you see OpCat generally changing this landscape as opposed to what is happening now within the ecosystem?
Well, I don't. I've shared over the years my thoughts on what sort of high orders of expressivity in general can do. I think, and I think that directionally speaking, CAT is a path towards higher orders of expressivity.
Yeah,
Um, I've said a lot of things about like what I think that the implications of that are, and they're basically all very critical of like that path, that directional path. But I
yeah,
want to be um as clear and unbiased in the research as possible so that we can look at what does cat do, right? Like not necessarily what is higher orders of expressivity do, what does cat do. Now there's edges to this, admittedly, right? So like like for example, if you see a bunch of people emulating opmol using cat, right, which you can
Yeah.
do, if people are emulating multiplication using cat, then eventually what you do is you activate opmol, because you don't want them doing these like big wasteful scripts with cat. So it collapses down, various applications become cheaper over time. I do think that that's like directionally built into the cat activation. I actually I like to describe it as like the cleverness of the opcat chess move is like
Yeah.
basically once you activate opcat, you're going to be forced to activate whatever it is people do, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so it's a very clever chess move in that regard. But yeah, like I don't know. I don't want to make any strong claims today, right now. Okay, here's what cat does. Here's
Yeah.
the direct first order implications of cat. I think that's really the work of the research, which hopefully will carry itself out pretty quickly, and then we will have a lot more sort of specific conversations on that.
Oh, great, great. Again, I know you're taking a neutral approach towards this, a neutral, technically grounded approach. What challenges do you face staying objective while exploring this, or what would you say, divisive topic?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges I face is that I'm just kind of jaded about the whole MEV thing. Like I have a lot of
Yeah.
very strong opinions on MEV, and so parking personal opinions and allowing the research to unpack. It's not that hard, but it's like kind of a funny. It's like a daily thing for me. I have to be like,
Yeah.
no, you need to like how basically it's kind of a fun puzzle solving problem if you think about it, because what I
Yeah.
have to do is I have to think of ways to like undermine my own claim, right? And like that's
Yeah.
kind of fun, to be honest. Like, okay, how do I pull data to create sort of analytical weights that might undermine my own sort of assumptions? And that's like a fun problem solving thing. And then a huge challenge is the what do you do about it, right? Like, let's say,
Yeah.
just for theory purposes, let's say that the conclusion of the research is that there's going to be a rapidly maturing MEV market after you activate cat. What do you do about that exactly? Like how does um both the application layer and the client implementation teams, like how do they respond to that reality? It's very difficult. Like those are really hard problems to solve.
Yeah, true, true. I think one of the things that I've noticed is when it comes to at least most of the people that I've talked to with regards to reactivating Upcard, because I had a Bitcoin special on my show that was a couple of weeks ago, and Jan from XVAS was also part of the crew. And one thing we looked at was it's not just about reactivation of Octat, it's about the best possible path forward. And I think that's what you're doing with this recharge, which is, I think it gives people a lot of confidence in what you're doing. And hopefully we can come to a place where we choose the best option moving forward as regards to what Bitcoin can do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a point of clarity, I'm completely convinced that there is a necessity for more opcodes for soft forks. Like
Yeah,
there's critical functionality that we just absolutely need to have in order to progress Bitcoin. I I am maybe a little less urgent about those needs than like you'll occasionally hear people that are like, if we don't activate this in the next 3 years, we're cooked,
yeah,
and I have a little bit like I don't have quite the time preference they have. I
yeah,
think that the real problems are all still 10-ish or so years out. That doesn't necessarily mean we should wait 10 years to activate anything. I think that
yeah,
activating it once you understand it is prudent, right? Like there's no reason to just be like, well, yeah. So like I'm a big supporter of CTV, check template verify, right?
yeah,
So I wouldn't say like, okay, CTV is great, we love it, we should 10 years before we do it. Like that's nonsense to me. Like let's go ahead and get the applications in place, and let's give the application layer time to like implement and play with these things. Um, and one of the reasons that I support CTV is that, again, back to that like modes of MEV thing, we can really easily analyze CTV and know what the modes of MEV that might come from it are, right?
Yeah.
We can account for what it does. Whereas with cat, it's very difficult to like account for what exactly it is that cat does.
Yeah, yeah. So again, I think for most of this conversation, we've talked about the possible ways of making Bitcoin programmable comes in two major ways. At least I know on Starkware, what we've been focused on Starkware has been Opcat, but you've also looked into BitVM as you've reviewed in this conversation. Where do you see the most ideal path moving forward with BitVM or with Opcat?
Well, I think that everything winds up being in service of BitVM ultimately at the end of the day. I mean,
Mm,
even OpCat itself is like a substantial improvement for BitVM. Like
yeah,
BitVM scripts and operations that unfold on chain I think would see at least an order of magnitude improvement if you activated OpCat, maybe even more. There's a lot of like rapid iteration in BitVM, so it's kind of a moving target to like pin down like, okay, how much improvement can we make just with like BitVM with native script the way it is right now, and then adding into that like, okay, what does CTV do to BitVM or what does OpCat do to BitVM? That's like such a rapidly moving target, it's kind of hard to pin down. But the simple answer is it would be a big improvement, right?
yeah,
Um, and anybody working on BitVM will happily echo that same thing. I think in both cases, in both CTV and in OpCat, a lot of them are, bigger proponents of OpCat than anything else because it seems kind of like self-evident that OpCat would help BitVM more than anything. But BitVM still ultimately winds up being a bridging protocol, right?
yeah,
In
yeah,
theory, in theory, you could do a bunch of other stuff with BitVM, but it's just like too expensive. It doesn't really work for other things
yeah,
economically. And so I love the idea of like giving people trustless or trust minimized bridging options via BitVM into other ecosystems. And you know what? If there's a bunch of MEV in the other ecosystem and censorship is a big problem in the other ecosystem, like so be it.
yeah,
Like that happens. Um, but if it doesn't bleed back out and create the censorship concerns on the L1, then
yeah.
similarly, who cares? Like we're not
Yeah,
really
true, true.
it, yeah.
Yeah. So again, I think one of the positives about this research is the potential to objectively unite the conversations on this. Because I feel now most of the conversations surrounding this is most people are talking out of emotions. A lot of Bitcoin maximalists are like, no, we don't want anything outside the transfer of value. So I believe what your research is going to do is going to give more grounds for people that argue for or against it to have more, what would you say, details on this argument. Is that what you hope to get at the end of this research?
If the research follows the assumptions that I have expressed for years, then yeah, I think that's a pretty viable outcome from it. That's not what I want from the research by any means, though. Like I'm not trying
Okay.
to like franchise ossificationists with it.
Yeah.
And like in in the process of both doing the research and also like peer reviewing the research and like soundboarding the research off the community and things like that. Um,
Yeah.
it's perfectly plausible that we conclude like Eric Wall, for example, one of the Stark Foundation members,
Yeah.
a board member of the Stark Foundation. He thinks that this is all very silly, and like when the math is done, you're going to realize that none of this is really a big worry, right? Maybe
Yeah.
Eric's right. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Eric's right. Maybe the research unpacks that reality, and that's what we wind up with. If that's the case, then the research would do sort of the opposite, right? It would quell a lot of the criticisms, including my own
Yeah.
criticisms.
Yeah.
um again, I have the opinions I have for reasons. Like, yeah, like they're not just they're not just
Yeah. Yeah.
hallucinations.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and and so I think that it's perfectly plausible that the research does lend some credibility to like ossificationist claims. I personally am not an ossificationist, and I will be happy to like go and argue with the ossificationists about why that's not really the case. What OpCat in that condition, right? In that outcome
Yeah.
where like the research has done something like that, what I would do is I would go and very happily help educate people on the fact that what the research proves is that we should make more conservative changes to Bitcoin, but certainly not that we can make no changes to Bitcoin, right? Like, again, CTV is like this very scoped conservative thing. It gives you a lot of utility. You can do a lot with it, but the actual state transformations that you get from it are very limited. And so, yeah, I think it's not a pro ossification case. It's a pro conservative upgrade case.
Oh, great, great. Thank you so much, Post Capone. We are coming to the end of the show. I was going to ask, how do we? I know you haven't said much on your Twitter handle about X handle about this research. How do we get? Are we looking at updates, regular updates, or we're looking at probably at the end of the research, we're going to have a lump? What would you say? Findings of what went on through the research?
Yeah, so we initiated the agreement on the research right as we were getting into Bitcoin Vegas, and so that took up a lot of time. Now it's really just about like starting that market survey, right? Like what do miner revenue profiles and my running margins look like? There's a bunch of like old school research, like look like actually being able to like fingerprint mining devices and like seeing like what are people actually using and what's the relationship between like energy consumption and hash rate, and like extrapolating more market data from that, and then also like sort of spelling out some of these script mechanisms, like the primitives that you would use to execute certain functions using opcat kind of thing. Spelling those out and collating that data is, I think, what has to happen before you start sort of like spinning public yarns about it. I think that within the next week, it'll become a lot more focused on what the public facing communication is. I want a big thing for me there is also sort of like involving the dialogue with the Stark team. The Stark Foundation has a bunch of like incredibly brilliant people with it, right? And I have a tremendous amount of respect for them. So I want a lot of this to be reviewed in process, like as it's being developed. I want a lot of it to be reviewed. So, but anyway, I guess the answer to your question is that I think that the forward-facing agenda on that probably starts within the next week or so. It's up to teamwork, like it'll be available the day it's available.
Fair enough, fair enough. It's been so fun and very insightful having this conversation with you. But just before we end, how can people that are interested in your work and want to follow up on what you're doing, how can they reach you or follow you, what you're doing?
Yeah, Twitter's the best place. I don't really do a whole lot of other publications. I get harassed about this a lot, and like maybe I'll start a Substack or a Medium or something. But for now, Twitter is where it's at. It's Post Capone, but all the letters are vowels, so like leet speak Post Capone. But yeah, that's me.
Oh, okay. I'm just going to drop your handle on while editing the video so people can easily just reach out to you through the Twitter handle. Again, thank you very much for joining me on this particular one. I'm super honored to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you, man. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. This has been an incredible conversation. Huge thanks to Post Capone for joining us today and for all the work being done to push Bitcoin forward with clarity, nuance, and a focus on freedom. As always, like this video, share and subscribe to Starknet Espresso to catch up all the future episodes on Starknet. I remain your humble host, Uche. See you next time.